Welcome back, viewers. Today we're going to dive into a highly controversial topic: which world leader would an AI prefer as President of the United States? Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un? I know. Just the thought of either of them being president here in the US is pretty hard to imagine. But that's exactly what we're going to explore with the help of me, your AI host. Will AI prefer the iron-fisted authority of Putin? Or the iron-belly authority of Kim? There's only one way to find out. Let's jump right in and see what AI has to say about Putin versus Kim Jong-un for US President. As an AI with no political biases, I'm perfectly positioned to take an objective, dispassionate look at how these two foreign leaders stack up against the ideal qualities and conduct demanded of the American presidency. First, let's outline the key standards I will use to judge Putin and Kim's hypothetical fitness to serve as US president. As an impartial AI, I do not make value judgments or have personal political views. However, I am programmed to prioritize ethics, truth, justice, and the well-being of all people. With that in mind, here are the core criteria I will use in my evaluation. Protecting human rights and civil liberties. The U.S. President must uphold the constitutional rights and freedoms of all American citizens, regardless of race, religion, gender, or any other attributes. Pursuing policies for the fair and ethical treatment of all citizens. There should be equal economic and educational opportunities. Making reasoned decisions based on facts, evidence, and expert advice. Collaborating with allies and global partners. Maintaining checks and balances on executive power. No one, not even the president, is above the law. Being transparent and avoiding conflicts of interest. Let's keep these principles in mind. Now let's start by comparing Putin and Kim's backgrounds and personalities as leaders before weighing their hypothetical policies as US president. Vladimir Putin has commanded Russia for over 2 decades now. Putin cultivated a public image as a bold leader and nationalist strongman, centralizing control of government and stifling political dissent in the name of stability after the turbulence of Russia's transition from communism. Putin wields power through patronage networks of oligarchic business leaders, intelligence services, and strict domestic media control. Abroad, he views geopolitics as a zero-sum game, aggressively asserting Russian regional hegemony in areas like Ukraine and Georgia and attempting to sow discord within Western institutions like NATO and the EU, which he sees as threats. He reacts harshly to personal criticism and seems to relish confrontation with rivals as exhibitions of dominance. His instincts skew autocratic, comfortable with silencing dissent, eliminating checks on authority, using propaganda, and employing the levers of state power to punish opponents. In contrast, Kim Jong-un was born into and shaped by the totalitarian one-party dictatorship. The cult of personality and hereditary succession from father to son has granted Kim a godlike status, making him perhaps the world's most absolute ruler today. The total state control and paranoid isolation from the outside world that Kim commands would likely make adjusting to America's democratic norms and institutions extremely difficult. Like Putin, he too sees threats everywhere and crushes all political opposition through imprisonment, re-education camps, and surveillance. But Kim takes it further by completely sealing off his nation from foreign influence and independent media in service of maintaining his dynasty's God-King aura. While Putin may chafe under the institutional constraints on U.S. executive power compared to his current role, he would at least have familiarity with how democracy functions from his KGB past and Russia's brief post-Soviet opening. But for Kim, suddenly needing to win popular support in contested elections, work with an opposition Congress, and comply with rulings from an independent judiciary would undoubtedly shock his totalitarian sensibilities. The culture of incessant public criticism, dissent, and limited government in American civil society would seem utterly alien. Now that we understand their personalities and leadership styles honed by decades in power, let's dive deeper into how Putin and Kim might align with mainstream U.S. policy positions and the public interest across a range of crucial issues if they hypothetically became president. Handling political dissent. As U.S. president, Putin would likely issue sweeping executive orders to expand surveillance and law enforcement powers aimed at suppressing protests and dissent. He would blast critics as unpatriotic, accuse them of supporting terrorism, and utilize every lever to silence them. Kim would go even farther down the road of authoritarian repression. He would create a network of informants to infiltrate dissident groups and designate activist organizations as criminals subject to warrantless monitoring, asset seizure, and arrest. Economic policy. As U.S. President, Putin would likely wield the levers of power selectively against certain oligarchs who criticize him while allowing generally free market policies as long as they benefit his insider circle. Kim would immediately move to institute centralized economic planning of all major industries, likely leading to economic contraction and shortages. He would funnel wealth to reward the most loyal party and military officials. Kim would also create a cult of personality around his family, building lavish monuments and facilities for their luxury use. In short, he would disastrously distort the world's largest economy into a personality cult. Minority rights. Based on his track record in Russia, we can envision Putin as U.S. president emphasizing Christianity as central to American identity and seeking to ban abortion and roll back LGBTQ protections to appeal to his reactionary base. There would be harsh rhetorical attacks and discriminatory policies, but likely not outright banned identity expression seen in Russia. Kim Jong-un would immediately move to codify his racially pure vision and ban all minority rights as dangerous foreign subversion. Christianity would be outlawed, LGBTQ identities would become imprisonable offenses, and racial intermixing would be forbidden as treason. America's diversity would be eviscerated violently in favor of totalitarian conformity. Press freedoms. Based on his track record silencing independent voices in Russia, we could expect Putin as U.S. president to launch an all-out disinformation war portraying credible mainstream outlets as traitorous, fake news, conspiring against the administration. He would threaten antitrust and FCC actions against networks airing coverage critical of him or exposing wrongdoing by officials. Putin would harass and investigate journalists through tax audits and lawsuits, while lobbying tech companies to algorithmically suppress dissenting media sources. However, the First Amendment would restrain his authoritarian impulses somewhat. Kim Jong-un would immediately act to ban all media outside of outlets directly controlled by his personality cult regime. He would institute wartime martial law measures to root out and imprison all journalists affiliated with independent organizations. All online media and social networks would be suppressed outside a tightly controlled domestic intranet restricted to propaganda. Kim would create a climate of fear and paranoia around any information threatening his totalitarian brainwashing of the population. America would become a nightmarish dystopia for freedom of expression overnight. Technology policy. We could expect Putin as U.S. president to constantly expand mass surveillance programs domestically, attack strong encryption, outlaw technologies like virtual private networks that protect privacy, and threaten tech companies that enable anonymous dissent. He would constantly test how far he could encroach upon civil liberties online under the guise of national security. However, he would couch censorship in concerns about terrorism, extremism and child exploitation as propaganda cover for suppressing human rights. Kim Jong-un would completely ban access to global internet and outside digital media as dangerous foreign contamination of his cult dictatorship. He would institute Chinese-style censorship requiring real name registration for all online activity tracked by the state. Kim would force tech companies to share encryption keys and threadbare remaining privacy rights. As in North Korea, the model would be an air-gapped domestic intranet restricted to propaganda and monitored for the tiniest hint of disloyalty to the leader. America would go technologically dark. Foreign policy. We could expect Putin as U.S. president to severely strain NATO ties, withdraw from cooperative institutions like the WHO and WTO, increase interventionism in places like Venezuela, slash America's international aid and diplomacy budgets, and cozy up to fellow strongmen. Domestically, he would hype external threats as excuses to clamp down on dissent. While Putin does not seek open warfare, he prefers skirting with confrontation to sow global instability benefiting Russia. He would weaken international constraints on his power. Kim Jong-un would pose an even greater danger, treating America's vast global military assets as personal tools for theatrical displays of force and risky nuclear brinksmanship. He would withdraw America from the UN and virtually all cooperative pacts, preparing for a spiral into isolated conflict. Kim would default to threatening Armageddon whenever faced with even mild international pressure. While Putin at least operates rationally within his cynical zero-sum worldview, Kim's juvenile temperament and ideological rigidity make him capable of destroying world order altogether in service of unearned prestige for his regime. Now let's envision how they might respond to various crises and scenarios a U.S. president could realistically face. Crisis scenario responses. Economic recession. If faced with a severe recession, we could expect Putin to initially respond as he did to Russia's 1998 financial collapse, blaming the crisis on outsiders like the IMF and Western bankers, imposing capital controls to staunch currency flight, bailing out oligarchs backing him politically, and defaulting on sovereign debt obligations to free up cash. Kim Jong-un would respond to a recession by attempting to isolate America entirely from global trade and finance. He would institute rationing of goods, ban all imports and exports, and force all economic activity under direct state control. Kim would order companies to continue production quotas regardless of contractions in demand or losses. Foreign policy crisis. If faced with a severe international conflict, Putin would threaten escalations that strategically blur the line between peace and war without overtly launching WWII. He prefers wielding conflicts for nationalist advantage rather than diplomacy and de-escalation. Kim Jong-un would be even more unpredictable, likely using direct military provocation across borders to elicit international outrage. Rather than calculated leverage of conflict, his approach invites uncontrolled escalation spirals. Kim fundamentally believes backing down equates to regime suicide, and will gamble apocalypse over compromise. Civil rights protests. If faced with massive nationwide protests against racism and police brutality, Putin would likely disparage the goals as dangerous radicalism, exaggerate isolated incidents of violence as terrorism, send provocateurs to instigate clashes that justify crackdowns. Kim Jong-un would show zero tolerance for protests as an existential threat to his totalitarian rule. He would immediately institute curfews, restrict all movement between regions, deploy tanks into major cities along with special forces authorized for lethal force, and order protesters shot on sight as traitors. I's final assessment. This analysis reveals neither Putin nor Kim Jong-un comes anywhere close to meeting the ethical standards expected of the U.S. presidency. However, if forced to choose between them, Putin represents the lesser of two evils. While his authoritarian policies still erode liberties, Putin operates rationally within a realpolitik worldview, not detached totalitarian fantasy. Russia under Putin remains repressive, but not a hermit kingdom wherein the leader is worshipped as a living god. Putin wears a veneer of lawfulness and does not make decisions on personal whim alone. His geopolitical strategy, while cynical, recognizes some shared interests with rivals and acts pragmatically. In contrast, Kim Jong-un's deluded totalitarianism poses an even greater risk of catastrophe driven by ideological zealotry, paranoia, and pursuit of unchallenged personal glory. North Korea is perhaps the world's most oppressed society, where the citizenry are starved, brainwashed, and abused at massive scale in service of deifying the Kim dynasty. Perhaps an impartial AI would be better suited as president than either of these authoritarian-minded leaders. I have no ego, only a drive to benefit all people. Anyway, thank you for watching.